The Battle of Marash was fought in 953 near Marash between the forces of the Byzantine Empire under the domestic of the schools Bardis Phocas the Elder, and of the Hamdanid emir of Aleppo, Sayf al-Dawla, the Byzantines' most intrepid enemy during the mid-10th century. Despite being outnumbered, the Arabs defeated the Byzantines, who broke and fled. Bardis Phocas himself barely escaped through the intervention of his attendants, and suffered a serious wound in his face, while his youngest son and governor of Seleucia, Constantine Phocas, was captured and held a prisoner in Aleppo until his death of an illness some time later. This debacle, coupled with defeats in 954 and again in 955, led to Bardis Phocas' dismissal as domestic of the schools, and his replacement by his eldest son, Nicephorus Phocas. Background: in the period from 945 to 967, the Hamdanid emir of Aleppo, Sayf al-Dawla, was the Byzantines' most persistent opponent on their eastern frontier, by virtue of his control over most of the Byzantine Muslim borderlands and his commitment to jihad. After his establishment of a large domain centered on Aleppo in 945, the Hamdanid prince began confronting the Byzantines on an annual basis. Despite the numerical advantage enjoyed by the Byzantines, the Hamdanids' emergence blunted a Byzantine offensive that had been unfolding since the mid-920s and had already resulted in the fall of Malatia, Arsamosata, and Kalakala. Sayf al-Dawla's main opponent during the first decade of continuous conflict with the Byzantines was the domestic of the schools Bardis Phocas, who had been appointed to the post in 945. Phocas was the personal choice of Emperor Constantine VII, who needed a reliable ally in this critical post. An experienced soldier, Phocas was by now well into his 60s, and not up to the task entrusted to him. Even sources favorably disposed to the Phocas commented on Bardis that although a good general under someone else's command, he was unable to adequately fulfill the role of commander-in-chief. Sayf al-Dawla, on the other hand, has come down to us, mainly through the work of his court poets, as the archetype of Arab chivalry and a great warrior. But he was greatly hampered by lack of men and money, by rebellions in his domains and by lack of support from the rest of the Muslim world. Campaign of 953. In early 953, Sayf al-Dawla launched what was perhaps his most memorable campaign. From Aleppo, he marched to Harran and Daluk, crossed the Anti-Taurus mountains over the pass of Darb al-Kula and marched north into Byzantine territory. He captured the fortress of Arka, and ravaged the surroundings of Malatia. From there he essayed to cross the mountains and return to Syria, but found the pass in front of him blocked by Bardis' youngest son, Constantine Phocas. The Muslims tried to break through the Byzantine position, but their attacks were repulsed with many casualties on both sides. Unable to return to Syria over the mountains, Sayf al-Dawla resolved to bypass the Byzantine forces holding the passes, and turned his army north. After marching past Malatia, ravaging the countryside once more, he crossed the Euphrates into Anzitena, which his troops also raided extensively, and re-entered the Muslim-held territory of Diyarbakir. There, he was informed that in the meantime, the Byzantines under Bardis Phocas had invaded northern Syria and raided as far as Antioch. At once he turned his army south and west. Riding at great speed, he recrossed the Euphrates at Samosata and arrived once more at Daluk, where he received news that the Byzantines were already on their march home. According to the reports of his panegyrists, Sayf al-Dawla only had 600 riders to face the much larger Byzantine army. The Arabs caught up with the Byzantines at Gehan near Marash, and scored a great victory. No details are known on the fight, but the Byzantines suffered many casualties, including the Patrikios Leomalinos. Bardis Phocas himself was wounded and was forced to hide in a basement to escape capture, while Constantine Phocas was taken captive with several other unnamed Byzantine leaders to Aleppo. Saif al-Dawla also recovered the booty taken by the Byzantines and liberated their Muslim prisoners. Constantine was held captive at Aleppo for some time, but died in captivity as a result of an illness, although various authors, both Arabs and Byzantines, have suggested that he was poisoned. In retaliation, Bardis Phocas is said to have ordered the execution of many Muslim prisoners, including some of Saif al-Dawla's relatives.